El mar que se desplazó dentro de la comunidad totalmente, hasta llegar a las parcelas, que es una distancia de cerca de 1 milla. Y más cuando uno tiene niños pequeños como yo, que tenía a mis nietas, que las saqué salieron de la otra casa, huyendo a la casa que estaba inundada, para yo meterlas a casa a las 4 de la mañana, que era un poco más alto, y ellas ver como el agua seguía subiendo y gritando: abuelo, sigue subiendo el mar, sigue subiendo el mar. Pues eso le rompe el corazón a uno por una mala decisión, que no vuelvo a tomar esa de quedarme aquí. Mejor prefiero que se pierda todo, pero me voy de aquí.
Hi, my name is Alejandra Castrodad-Rodríguez, and as I spent much of last night, I'll start by apologizing and let you know that I'm an economist, and just leave it at that by warning. I'm here today to talk about my work with a collaborative design model in Puerto Rico and a matching tool that we developed for communities to participate in the design process. First, I'd like to provide the briefest primer on Puerto Rico with a very specific focus on climate adaptation, design, and equity. Puerto Rico is a small Caribbean island country where the threat of climate change is not a matter of later, but now. Climate damages in the Atlantic have increased exponentially over the past decades, and Puerto Rico has been rated 6 in Germanwatch's most recent climate risk index. Perhaps known and maybe reduced to the picturesque touristic destination with gorgeous cobblestones, blue skies, and white sand beaches, our 500 kilometers of coastline house more than 60% of our population, and more than 500,000 people live under the constant threat of frequent and extreme flooding in Puerto Rico. We also have some of the most extreme inequalities in Puerto Rico, with tax incentives and massive investments in real estate, coexisting with dilapidated infrastructure, austerity, lack of access to services, gentrification, and displacement. Today in Puerto Rico, housing costs 10 times more than the incomes of half of the population. If you were to put in a Google search, Puerto Rico, corruption and news, you would get 9 million results. We're tainted by our politicians' worst instincts. But the Puerto Rican people have succeeded against all odds, defeating military practices in Vieques and Culebra, the Villa Verde natural gasoduct mega project, and even overthrowing the executive through popular movement in 2019 without a single life lost. Climate action projects in Puerto Rico are at the center of resistance, from holding government and developers to account, to defending natural areas from harmful developments. We also have a rich tradition of collectivized management of infrastructure, whether it's our historic community aqueducts, renowned estuarine community land trusts, or decentralized renewable energy systems. Before I get into our projects, I'd just like to briefly give you a peek into how it is we think about our work. So climate action, very basically, is about reducing the harmful effects of extreme events on people, places, and society, whether those have to do with natural events or human-made events. We normally think of this work as relating to infrastructure, which, as we've seen, might be about drainage or flood protection and what buildings look like. But also, as our colleagues have been demonstrating, has a lot to do about choosing where you have open and natural spaces and how much our communities need or want these spaces there. Also, most of us immediately think of design as putting pen to paper and drawing something. But I like to think of design in its broadest sense as coming up with a solution intentionally, using all the tools and information at our disposal. And collaborative design, in our model, is about integrating different and diverse sources of knowledge, whether that knowledge comes from science and official institutions or from lived experience and cultural practices. Since our collaborative design is equity-centered, all these knowledge bases have equal value. And the way in which we center And the way in which we center equity is by focusing on the root causes of inequalities and specifically targeting imbalances in power. And this isn't just about the core of accessing resources, capital, and assets, but it's also about having the information and the know-how to participate in the conversation in a meaningful way, and having access to the places where design and decisions are taking place. Radical collaborative design is less about implementing solutions for or in marginalized communities, like this very real bridge to nowhere, and more about communities and citizens being an integral part of designing the solutions that meet their needs and priorities. The collaborative design model was born in Playita 18 months before Hurricane Maria. The project then was targeting water justice.
Eso era agua, esto lo secamos nosotros. Y por eso dice Calle Unión, que también lo hicimos nosotros. Eso era agua de aquí hasta la Valdorión.
Playita is a community of rural migrants pushed to the outskirts of San Juan who built their community right on top of the La Laguna Los Corosos. In the first stage of our collaborative design process, co-learning, the idea is to bring together the broadest and most diverse coalition of experts and exchange information. We wanted to find ways to integrate that knowledge in a meaningful way, not just put everyone's perspective into a joint report. And since flooding was the main threat, a team from Deltares and the University of Wisconsin worked on a flood model, and then they came back to Puerto Rico and they asked the community, what did we get wrong? The leaders were swift and precise in identifying the places that lived experience and the model didn't match. And although we could only see very small changes in the recalibrated model for the less intense events, in the cases of more extreme events, the floods that were originally thought of as having 3 to 4 feet could actually go as high as 8 to 10 feet for the model that is the equivalent of Hurricane Maria. This model accurately predicted the level of flooding that persisted in the community for 14 days after the storm. More importantly, it was this model, developed with input by the community, that gave us the credibility to evacuate residents for the shorelines of the lagoon, including this single mom with 3 children under 10 from this home. The coalition that had come together for water justice also swiftly mobilized to document the damages to home, deploy volunteers to build rooftops and community solar solutions. Once release efforts were done, organizations on the ground had to start thinking about how and why this Category 4 storm had taken this power grid and decimated, leaving the entire population without power, and 30% of consumers still without power 4 months after the storm. Where exactly were the final 30% of the communities located? So we documented hundreds and hundreds of tweets by the Power Authority notifying restoration of power to those communities during that period. We georeferenced them and mapped them so that we could understand where it was that investments for reliable, renewable electricity would be needed the most. We also considered the intersections between that delay in restoration and other factors such as poverty to better prioritize our work with our partners. ilumiNACIÓN was born from the need to translate technical data into information for action. Initially, the data that we'd worked on informed Resilient Power Puerto Rico and other donors' investments in solar energy systems from Daguao in one of the hardest hit communities in the East Coast, to El Coquí in one of our environmental justice communities suffering from decades from the fossil fuel generation impacts. Resources were being distributed through competitive funding in Puerto Rico after Maria. But the communities that needed those investments the most had the least capacity to compete for them. So ilumiNACIÓN is a web platform with 4 tools designed to support communities by generating actionable data to develop proposals in projects that range from climate vulnerability to renewable energy. The first tool is the energy calculator, which allows users to create inventories of their appliances and equipment. They then document when and how frequently those equipments are used, as well as which equipments are essential to their day-to-day operation. Our aim is to nurture their engagement with the design process and challenge preconceived ideas of who it is that can design. So instead of completing the audits ourselves, we trained participants from programs in our partnering organizations, Coordinadora Paz para las Mujeres, and the Jane Stern Community Library. And these participants received grants and training to audit 20 centers across Puerto Rico, which we then provided technical assistance with to develop their clean energy solution proposals. The first data set in the calculator helps users understand how it is that they're consuming energy and to decide whether energy efficiency investments are worthwhile. This is the library where, to our surprise, in pink, most of their consumption was focused on lighting, instead of the AC, which we see in the deep purple. The calculator then estimates the exact savings the user will have if they make and they implement those retrofits, which in the library's case, post-implementation meant a 30% reduction in their consumption total. This means that community centers can then refocus that money and those savings into critical services for the communities they serve.
Parte del proceso
Sorry, I also have the wrong presentation, but I'm going to move on. So the second set of data that is produced by the calculator relates to being able to decide whether a certain system size is sufficient to satisfy the consumption in that center. What the data does is tell you whether you have enough energy to consume during the day, in purple, but also enough energy to deposit into the battery, in yellow, and then consume, in pink, from the battery when there's no sun. In this case, the 35K system clearly isn't sufficient to satisfy demand for energy, and the user in the iterative process has the opportunity to optimize by reducing their consumption. Alternatively, they can increase the system size to satisfy that demand, and here we see that they'll be able to store as much energy that they'll need to consume later from the battery. Sorry. Our focus is on ensuring that communities can produce the energy they need over a 24-hour cycle because of the ever more and frequent and longer blackouts that we continue to have in Puerto Rico after the privatization of the power grid 3 years ago. Here, Alana Feldman from Centro Paz para Ti discusses how she used this process to expand their system and satisfy their increasing program.
Centro Paz para Ti es un proyecto de Coordinadora Paz para las Mujeres. Así que nosotras hemos ido instalando sistemas solares poco a poco según hemos ido identificando fondos y recursos para hacerlo. Así que llega un momento en el que nos damos cuenta que estamos creciendo más rápido de lo que puede nuestro sistema solar mantenerse al día, ¿verdad? Poder servir nuestras necesidades. Así que ahí es realmente donde la colaboración con Resilient Power nos es de una gran utilidad, porque Resilient Power nos ayuda a poder hacer la auditoría energética que nos permite identificar cuáles son los usos y las necesidades y las proyecciones que tenemos para el uso de electricidad aquí en las instalaciones.
The main goal of optimization is ensuring an investment that will ensure continuous provision of critical services in these centers for the communities. Climate action is ultimately about protecting home, about our sense of safety, shelter, refuge, and self. Our proposal is simple. Prevailing and resisting against the threat posed by climate change, whether it's natural or anthropogenic, hinges on design practices that are based on a trust of the other. Each one of us needs to consider how to relinquish power and recognize that knowledge born from science, lived experience, and cultural practices has equal value and isn't just useful, but necessary for radical solutions. We may individually hold knowledge, but wisdom will always be collective. Climate action will require radical wisdom. Sabidurías radicales, muchas gracias.